Well, look, let's go to Alain Tolhurst now, who's a chief reporter at Politics Home, to talk about some of the stuff that we've been talking about today, in particular cover-ups by the police. Alain.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So what do you make of this this story that's now been brewing for the last couple of days, that it seems that Warwickshire Police did indeed provide diktats to councillors and others in authority up in Warwickshire not to say anything about the fact that 2 Afghan asylum seekers were alleged, and again we have to tread carefully here, have been alleged to have committed A, rape, and B, in the second count, the second instance, a charge of conspiracy to rape. So again, to make it clear, they've been charged, not found guilty, they've not been convicted. However, it does seem that the police sought to cover this up, and it's the same old line from our so-called authorities, Alan, which is that of trying to ensure that we don't incite some kind of community tension. That's what happened that facilitated 20 or 30 years ago the emergence and continuation of the grooming gangs, isn't it?
Well, I don't know if you can directly link those two things necessarily, but I certainly think you're right.
The same motive, the same diktat has led exactly to both of these things that we're talking about today. I mean, inarguably, if we hadn't had a situation where Labour councillors predominantly and the police and other members of the authorities, particularly in the likes of Rochdale and elsewhere, if they weren't covering these things up, then those things, perhaps those people would have been brought to justice quicker and fewer people would have been raped. I think it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah, although I do think, having seen what's happened with terms of arrests or investigations into police officers and their kind of culpability in those scandals, I think part of the reason why those terrible kind of gangs and stuff weren't uncovered earlier was because simply that the police weren't bothered about it. It wasn't necessarily that they could cover it up, they just simply were not acting, in some cases were colluding with those people involved. But I think in this instance, it's a classic example, I think, what we've seen a lot recently, that just the way that the police and their communications, their kind of systems for it are just really poor, because every time they try and say they're doing something to not provide information, to prevent something from happening, all that does is create a vacuum into which people put their own ideas anyway. And the fact is that if these things are not mentioned, then people have an inkling as to what it is that they're trying to sort of not tell us, essentially, and that causes the same problems that they're trying to prevent. And I think we've seen this not just around the kind of grooming gang stuff, we've seen it around other high-profile cases where the police, their kind of policy of not giving out this information until the very last moment creates more problems than it tries to solve.
And Alain, we saw, didn't we, in the summer, that as a consequence of the public perceiving that things were being withheld with regard to the Southport murders, we saw that there was, as a consequence, that fuelled unrest. Keir Starmer certainly didn't assist that situation. It turns out, obviously, that the Labour government knew exactly who Axel Rudabakana was, and indeed knew that he had, it seems, had ricin hidden under his bed and an Al-Qaeda manual. But despite that, of course, they allowed speculation to run and run and run, and indeed, some would argue, fibbed about the fact that this was a choir boy from Wales. Why is it then that the authorities 12 months on have not learnt those lessons and continue seemingly to cover up not only the ethnicity of these alleged assailants, but the very crimes themselves? What do they think they're achieving? Because this is going to, as Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, has been saying this morning, this is going to trigger further unrest.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I think West Midlands Police are going to have to answer. They say they're hiding behind the fact is that the national policy on this stuff is not to release the ethnicity and other data or other kind of information about people when they're charged and potentially until later on. But that just doesn't wash. As we've seen last year, we've seen in lots of other cases that we've been talking about, that just simply creates kind of further problems, essentially. And you talked about the information on Axel Rudabakana. All sorts of kind of spurious information was being put out there online because the official story was not being fleshed out properly, and that will continue to happen, and it will continue to lead people to think, what are people hiding if they're not telling us these things? And that.
But Alan, when it's a white person, Alan, sorry, I'm losing you a little bit, but I'm going to try and persevere. Hopefully you can hear me okay, but we're losing you a little bit. But when it's a white person, it seems that they do reveal the ethnicity of that individual immediately, don't they? Alan, I think we may have lost you, I'm afraid. OK, well, look, I'm going to ramble on about this because I'm incensed by it. Let me know what you think of this. Do you think there is ever a reason, an excuse for the police or any other authority, frankly, to withhold the crimes that are suspected as having been committed by migrants, by asylum seekers? Do you think it's ever OK for the ethnicity of those individuals to be withheld, to be covered up? I mean, I would strongly suggest that if there is a pattern emerging by way of the fact that there's a propensity, there's a likelihood, if you like, a greater propensity, a greater likelihood of some to commit crimes, particularly of a violent or a sexual nature, where they do come from particular nations, then surely rather than covering it up, we should know, because we have a right to know as taxpayers and as voters, as a democracy, we have a right to know that. But also then if it's transparent and it's debated, then surely we can try and seek to do something about it rather than literally sweeping it under the carpet. Well, look, while we try and get Alan back, let's speak to a caller, Kevin in Portsmouth, about migrants. Kevin, thanks for calling Talk.
Good, what are we? Good afternoon?
It's definitely afternoon. What time did you get up, Kevin?
Not that early, but time flies when you're having fun. Right now, I was actually calling you more about the Gilets Jaunes. Actually, I was talking to the Calvados Police Nationale chief in Caen a few years ago, and was saying that the Gilets Jaunes, like the demonstrators outside the various migrant hotels and blocks of flats and everything else, were peaceful.
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, you're right. They've gone to a roundabout, gummed the place up for a couple of hours, send a copper down saying, come on, guys, you've had your fun, move on. They've gone to the next roundabout and do it all over again. The country was behind them. Now, one of the reasons this happened was the price of road fuel in France started out 20% less than the UK and is now 20% more than the UK. Now, that is a hell of a jump.
Well, through taxation?
Just the cost of it at the pumps. How it got there, I have no idea.
It must be taxation because oil price is oil price. So yeah, I presume it's greater taxation now in France. Yeah.
Yeah. So and that comes out of taxed income. You're in rural France. You've got to travel to work, maybe quite a long way, and that really jacks up the cost of everything. Now, a friend of mine posted his shopping list, and he went into a local supermarket, and a weekly shop cost him something like €280.
So Kevin, forgive me, how does this relate to migrants rather than the cost of living in Paris?
Yeah, no, it was in Caen. But no, how it relates to the migrants was the Gilets Jaunes were completely peaceful. This is the reason why they're demonstrating. This is the reason why the country was pretty much behind them.
But the French do protest about everything, don't they?
They do, but it's very rare that you get the whole country saying, yeah, we need to do something about this.
And are you saying that the French authorities gave in because of the weight of those protests?
No, they gave in because of COVID, because COVID came along and that knocked it on the head. But the point the guy was making was, he said, look, for 3 weeks, these guys were absolutely fine, moved them on. Everybody's quite friendly because the cops are fairly sympathetic too because their prices had gone up by the same amount. He said until the anarchists turned up.
Yeah, indeed. Kevin, look, we're going to have to leave it there because my friend Alain Tolhurst is back. Kevin in Portsmouth, thank you very much indeed. Good point at the end there, until the anarchists turned up, of course. Alain, are you back?
I am indeed, yes. Sorry about that, Russell.
That's okay. Where were we, sir? We were talking about... I don't know what we were talking about. Let's move on anyway, because I've got 2 or 3 other things to talk to you about.
Sure.
What do you make of the defection? We will be talking in half an hour's time to Rupert Matthews, who is the latest defector from the Conservative Party to Reform. He is the Police and Crime Commissioner for Leicestershire. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's interesting because it kind of plays into kind of a narrative at the moment, which is a lot of people on the right of politics are making that jump over from the Conservatives to Reform. And I think you saw with someone like Jake Berry, the former MP, the former vice chairman of the Conservative Party. And I think it's not about the individuals themselves and necessarily what they represent or how high profile they are. It's the kind of the movement, the kind of the momentum on the right of British politics is all with Reform, that people look to the future. They look to their potential re-election in whatever level of politics that might be and see that Reform are the way of making that so. And I think we're going to continue to see that. Ambitious politicians, perhaps people who've been in politics before and want to get back into it, will look to Reform, I think, ahead of the Conservatives. And that, I think, is what's should worry the Conservatives, really, because they've lost a huge amount of councillors. They lost something like 3,000 councillors in the last 3 local elections. So all the kind of ground staff are all gone. Essentially, if people are then leaving to move into Reform, it's going to be much harder for them to kind of claw back their electoral position.
Well, and Alan, this isn't a bad scalp for Reform, isn't it? A police and crime commissioner. I mean, I would say that's one rung down from an MP. I don't know if you'd agree with that analysis. When are we going to start seeing some? And of course, we've seen Jake Berry, who's a former Conservative MP. He has defected, so he's resigned his membership of the Conservative Party. He's now a Reform member, very publicly, from 2 or 3 weeks ago. When do we start to see serving Conservative MPs defecting? Do you think they'll still wait and see how the wind vane is, which direction it is pointing in over the next year or two, in terms of where they're likely to win their seat as a Conservative, or whether they need to jump ship? And I'm not suggesting that MPs are selfish and only think about themselves in terms of preserving their political seat, but do you think that sometime soon we will start seeing defections of Conservative MPs to Reform?
Well, there was a lot of speculation around Suella Braverman. We know that her husband had joined Reform, and there was talk of her joining him and becoming a Reform member. But then it seems like they fell out with Zaya Youssef, and Suella Braverman's husband fell out, and it seems like that's less likely to happen at the moment, certainly while Zaya Youssef is still involved with Reform. So I think that one kind of knocked that one on the head. In terms of other MPs, I think that they definitely want to see the direction of travel. I think we know that how big next year's elections are in May. Obviously, there's not just kind of the local elections, there's also elections in Wales and in Scotland. And
unless they're cancelled, Alan, can I just make the point? So where I live in Essex, the ruling administrations decided to cancel the elections. They say it's because of devolution. I think this also happened in some parts of Kent and elsewhere, but certainly the county elections were cancelled. And a cynic, which I can often be, by the way, may suggest that was because of the rise of Reform. The Conservative and even the Liberal Democrats and certainly Labour were very, very frightened indeed with regard to holding elections this May, because, well, Essex County Council would have been wiped out. It would have gone from dark blue to turquoise. I mean, do we think that could happen again in May 2026? I mean, because that's anti-democratic.
No, I think that's not going to happen, simply because the part of the reason was that there are reforms coming into the way that local authorities are run by the Labour government, and
devolution.
Those reforms, essentially changing it so that everywhere, instead of having these authorities where there's two or three tiers, you have a town, a district, and a county council, kind of moving all of them to become unitary authorities where there's just one council. That essentially will happen before we get to the next set of elections. So therefore, there'll be no reason to delay elections further. But I do think that point next year, May 2026, will be a big kind of inflection point for those in the Conservative Party who might want to perhaps get rid of someone like Kemi Badenoch and bring in, if they did do that and brought in someone like Robert Jenrick, perhaps some of those people who've been looking to move to Reform might be tempted to stay on if they do think that the party is still going in the wrong direction after that point. And we could see some further defections then.
There will also be mayoral elections, directly elected mayors in some parts of the country, including Essex, by the way. So that will be very interesting indeed to see how.
And we know Reform will target those definitely. Obviously, they targeted them in Lincolnshire, where they won a couple of months ago, and I think we'll definitely see them target those places where they can get those kind of big, high-profile, directly elected figures. I think we'll definitely see Reform going for a lot of those as well.
And finally, just the last thing I want to touch on with you is private schools. And I must declare an interest here. I went to private school, believe it or not. I know I seem like an unpolished former Essex or current Essex former estate agent, but I did go to private school, but only till the age of 11. One of my 3 daughters goes to private school, so I'll declare a little interest here. But 50 private schools, Alan, have shut in the last 12 months since Labour. In fact, it's less than that. So since Labour actually put up VAT on fees, which is the beginning of this year, 50 private schools, some of them 200, 300, 400 years old, have shut. You would imagine that Labour would not want to be seen as a party that wants to diminish education in Britain. But it seems that because, I guess you could call it the politics of envy, the green-eyed monster of, again, student politics and Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer and others, and the fact that they haven't snapped out of that political ideology from when they were back at school, that displaces about 30,000 children educationally. They should be ashamed of themselves, shouldn't they?
Well, I will just sound a note of caution there. I'll also declare an interest. I did go to private school, but my thoughts on this are actually that if you look at the figures, at least 50 private schools do close their doors every year for various reasons. And actually, if you look at the number of private schools that exist, that number has actually gone up in the last year.
So you're saying that the imposition of 20% extra on the school fees of each child in those private schools across Britain has made no difference at all?
Oh, no, not at all. I'm not saying that, but I think the kind of headline figure, I think you have to understand in the context of the education system more broadly. There are clearly schools where the leaders of those schools have said, we are closing because of this. But that number 50 refers to not just schools that have closed, but also schools that intend to close in the future. So I don't think it's quite as sort of catastrophic for the whole industry.
Let me answer it this way. Do you think it's right to tax education?
Well, that's a question for the politicians, not for the journalists, I'm afraid.
I'm interested in your view.
Well, look, as someone who's been to private school, yeah, it is interesting. I think that it was always seen as a strange one that private schools that made a kind of profit were seen as like charities again, Alan, and got a tax break.
Ideology. Well, it's not a tax break, is it? I mean, it's just the fact that VAT was not applied previously to school fees, like it's not applied to, I don't know.
Well, many,
children's clothes, right? Are we saying that parents get a tax break because little jeans and little tiny trainers for 3-year-olds are not taxed? I mean, look, I don't buy that at all. And of course, the fact remains that the amount of money that Rachel Reeves thought that she was going to see as a consequence of this policy, it's not, in terms of tax take, going to be anything like she thought it was. No. So it's an absolute economic shooting in the foot, as we've come to expect from Labour, frankly. Alain Tolhurst, thank you very much indeed. Sorry we lost you for a bit, but you came back with, with a vengeance. That's Alain Tolhurst there from, political home. So, politics home, sorry.